I am Pastor Joshua LeBorious. I'm a pastor in Southern California, the Ontario Riverside area. If you don't know anything about California besides the big cities, it's about an hour and a half east of LA. And it's kind of a weird congregation. Just to kind of give you a picture of what my context is. It's my first call out of the seminary, and when I received it, it's a plant. It's a church plant. But as I learn more about the congregation, it's not a church plant, right? It's been going for about 13 years. 13 years now. They're chartered. They have the only thing that still qualifies them as a church plant, that qualifies us as a church plant, is that we do not have a building, which poses a set of challenges, but it also does pose a lot of interesting opportunities to get into ministry in a way that I am seeing is really, really beneficial, and that's has contributed to this in some ways. And one of my elders is here, and so I can thank him directly. But my elders have been really, really flexible with how I do. A lot of times when I first got here, I'd ask the elders, "How do we do this? How do we do this?" Looking for what the church usually does, and the answer almost every time was, however you want to do it, Pastor. So I've gotten kind of this flexibility to try a lot of this stuff out in almost like a sandbox kind of way. So that's where I am. And my background that feeds into this, if I'm being honest, a lot of it was probably from my parents, because as I'm discovering this stuff and learning this stuff kind of explicitly, I look back on stuff my dad did in ministry, because he was a DCE for 25, 26 years. Now he's an SMP pastor, so he's still doing a lot of the same stuff, but he does a lot more administration now. And I'm learning all this stuff, and I think back to stuff that Dad did when I was growing up, and I was like, oh, that was strategic. That was on purpose. You're doing all of it, not much he did was accidental. So I do have to give a lot of credit to the way my mom and dad went about ministry. But then I started to learn kind of intentionally about this. I went to Vanderbilt University for my undergraduate degree in Nashville, Tennessee. I double majored in education studies and mathematics and minored in comp sci. And from there I went to the seminary, Concordia Seminary in St. Louis. And I'm currently working through my dissertation, or my doctoral program. I haven't started the dissertation yet, at Liberty University, which is out in Virginia. And you're like, wait, you're in SoCal. Virtual program. It's great. And the reason I bring that up isn't to show off or whatever. The reason I bring up the doctoral program bit is because the subject of it's a doctorate of education, and the subject of my research is going to be, and brace yourselves because this is the academic part, how do relational networks in a congregation reflect in habits of spiritual formation? And what that is in regular English is, how many friends do you have at church, and how does that impact how you do your devotions, how you pray, how you are in your word, how you're involved with Bible study, how often are you in worship? That's the research I want to do. So warn your pastors, if an email comes to them in about a year asking them to get people to take a survey, please do it. I need a sample size of about 5,000 to accurately draw conclusions about the LCMS. But that, a lot of the classwork and a lot of the reading I've done for that is what feeds in to what I'm talking about today. And at this point, if you guys can hand these around, I thought about doing a tech presentation for this, and then I thought, it's not really going to add that much if I have a PowerPoint behind me. So this is a handout with what I think is the most relevant information from the presentation, and we're going to talk through it. So this is kind of how I want to approach things. I'm going to start with the foundations and kind of the ideas that lead into this. And there are some practical ones, there are some strong biblical ones, and then there's some theoretical ones. And then we're going to look very briefly at what implementation looks like. You may be sitting there and noticing that there are some differences between my church and your church. That's why implementation is so short, because I can tell you the broad strokes, but the specifics are going to be different at most congregations, which is why most of our time is going to be on the next part, which is the principles for application. Okay, so the specific implementation will change based on where you are, based on what your context looks like. The principles that I have for you you would have to do some convincing to tell me they don't really apply in most places. And then there are some weaknesses that I think are worth talking about, and I have some examples from my own congregation that I would like to share with you to hopefully give you an image of what this actually looks like in reality. So, starting with foundations, the practical one, when I was at Vanderbilt, I worked in campus dining. As you can imagine, it sucked. It was a bad job. And to illustrate this, my freshman year, of all the people they hired at the beginning of all the student workers they hired at the beginning of my freshman year, their turnover rate was 70%. At the end of the year, 70% of all the people they had hired had quit, or mostly quit. A couple of them had probably been fired, but most of them just quit. Because, as I mentioned, it was a bad job. It sucked. The hours were not good. The job was not fun. It wasn't an impressive thing you got to put on your resume. So when people found other opportunities, they took it. I stuck around because, frankly, if you worked enough hours, you got a meal plan discount. That, for me, was worth it. So I stuck around, and I got promoted to student manager. And my second year while I was at Vanderbilt, one of the adult managers, so he wasn't a student. This was his full-time job. He approached me and he said, "Hey, we're starting something." He was calling the guardianship program, and I'd like you to spearhead it. What the guardianship program was very simple. We need to fix this problem. We can't turn over 70% of our workers every year. Like, this is not sustainable. And as we were going about that and playing, because that's all he gave me. He was like, "Go, do things," and I thought about why I was there. And the money was a big part of, I'll be totally honest, the money was a big part of why I was there. But as I thought about it, I didn't hate going to work anymore. When I first got that job, well, the first couple weeks I was kind of excited because it was the first job I ever had. But after that wore off, I did not want to go to work. But at the end of the year, I was like, oh, it's not so bad. And the other thing I noticed is I had two shifts. I had a Thursday night shift and a Saturday brunch shift. And objectively speaking, the Saturday brunch shift was worse. You had to get there early. It was always busy. Everything was a hot mess because you had to do different food from the weekdays, which means you had to completely clear out everything from the weekdays and reload everything. Saturday was bad. But I preferred my Saturday shift. And I sat there thinking, why? Why don't I hate going to work anymore? Why do I like my worst shift? And it's because all my friends, I had made friends in campus dining, and all my friends worked the Saturday shift. And the principle that kind of landed there was work sucks less if you're working with friends. Okay? So what we did with the guardianship program is the next time we made schedules, we did our best to put friends on the same shifts. We had a form. You could request your slots. You could say, when you had class, so we couldn't schedule you. And then the last part was, is there anyone you want to work with? And we tried to schedule friends together. And then our student managers who were assigned with putting people in the different spots in the dining hall, we told them, put people by, if you have two buddies who are working, let them work a food line together. What we do is not hard. You scoop food out of a tray, put it on a plate, hand it to somebody. You can talk with the person next to you while you do that. This is not rocket science we're trying to accomplish here. So as long as they're still doing their job, let them work next to their friends, let them go on break together. And the other task that we gave our managers was every single shift have one conversation with every employee that is not related to work. Take an interest in their classes and their hobbies and their family. I don't care what it is. Talk with them about something that shows you care about them as a person, not just as an employee. And I would love to tell you that it fixed our retention problem entirely, that we went from 70% to 0%. It did not, but we went from 70% to somewhere around 30%. Okay? And if I can get people to stick around for 6-hour shifts at campus dining just by encouraging some friendships, I'm thinking church is a lot less painful than that, right? We can get people to stay at church just by encouraging those relationships. So that's kind of this practical piece that pushes into it. And what's fascinating is once you start looking for that relational aspect of ministry in Scripture, it is all over the place. In fact, one could argue, and I'm not going to argue, that's not what this session is for, but one could argue that a relational model for ministry is a lot closer to what the biblical model is than kind of we're going to sit in a classroom and we're going to learn and we're going to take our notes and it's going to be kind of academic. There's some value to that, don't get me wrong. There's value to kind of academic learning about stuff. But if you look at the Old Testament, how Israel was called to share their faith and to pass their faith on to each other, it was one of the biggest means was feasts and festivals. Which sounds very pious. We have our feasts and our festivals. Guys, that's food and parties. The God said, I want you to have this party. I want you to get food together. And while you're there, talk about me. Talk about what I have done for you as a people. Share that with your kids. And it takes place in this social space, in this community space. And then if you look at Jesus' ministry, he does do some teaching, right? The Sermon on the Mount, he's kind of just laying things out for people, but a lot of times it is by example. He is showing people what to do. He is having dinner with people. He's sitting down for meals with people. He's working in friendship with his disciples to show them the things of God, the things about himself. And then if you look at, and this is fascinating, it was fascinating for me. I guess I don't know if you care about it. But there are a couple of books on your little sheet. There's a bibliography on, or references on the back because I'm in APA mode. There are a couple of books on here, no, I just have one. No, I do have two. The two by J.W. Thompson, Pastoral Ministry According to Paul and The Church According to Paul. What this guy Thompson does is he walks through the epistles, and obviously Paul specifically, and he says, y'all, we need to get rid of this individual idea of discipleship. It's not about your relationship with Jesus. It's not about how much you understand. It is about how close is the community moving to Christ. Whenever Paul talks about discipleship and growth in the faith, it is how are you doing together? So there's this biblical push, especially when you're looking for it, and maybe because I'm looking for it, if I'm being honest, there's a biblical push toward this relational community attitude toward discipleship. And then because I did my undergrad in education, this is stuff that I think is very important, and I'm very science-leaning. Neuroscience and educational theory also overwhelmingly support this kind of learning. So you could go to countless educational philosophers or educational theorists and they would tell you social learning is the way to approach learning. I'm not going to list them all for you. My two favorite, if you're going to ask, Josh, what educational theorists should I read up on? Lev Vygotsky and Piaget. I think it's Jean Piaget. If I could point you to two people, those are the two guys I'm going to point you to. And especially what they lay out is people don't learn in a vacuum. People learn in the context of the people they are learning with and the models that are in front of them. So in a classroom setting, it would be people learn with the students who are next to them and the teachers who are in front of them, and kind of seeing how everybody is interacting, seeing how people interact with material. So that's kind of the educational theory that goes into this. But what I find maybe more fascinating and more compelling is neuroscience. So there's a book on here. It's the last one on there by Wilder and Hendricks. And I have a couple guys in my congregation who are either at the seminary or they're thinking that direction right now, and they say, what books should I read? This is the first one I give them, because the seminary it's not a seminary assigned book. But the two authors are a neuroscientist and a theologian, and they got together and they wrote about this stuff. And what they found, because when we think about discipleship, a lot of times we think about teaching people the right answers. You know what God wants you to do. You know what is right about God. But what these two guys point out is that is way too late in the game. Because life very rarely gives you time to stop and think, what should I do here? Like if you're getting in a heated conversation with someone, you can't say hold on, give me 20 seconds, let me reflect on this and meditate on it in context of my learning, right? Life happens too quickly. We don't think, we react. And that comes from an instinctive place, that comes from an emotional place. And the neuroscience scientist chimes in and he's like physically speaking, the cognitive parts of your brain take longer to fire than the emotional, than the reactive. So the question that this book poses, the question that I was very interested in at this point is, well, how do you change that part? How do you shape people's instincts? How do you shape people's emotional responses? And what they found is the most powerful tool for shaping that is group identity. Who do you call my people? Who are the people surrounding you that you say, these are the people I respect, these are the people I want to approve of me, these are the people that I want to be like? And that specifically takes place in two ways. Okay, this kind of community impact on how you think, how you react. Okay, and the first way, for most of us, is not going to be an issue, and it's modeling. Right? If you're constantly around Christians in a bunch of different contexts, you see how they act. You see how they talk to people. You see how kind they are to waiters and waitresses. You see how they are on the sports. Like, you see all these things, and you start to emulate that, because that is what you see all the time. The other element, I think, we tend to be a little hesitant of because we're very averse to it in our society as a rule, and in the church, I believe, as well. And that is shame. Shame is a very, very powerful tool. And the neuroscientist kind of jumps in during this part of the conversation in the book, and he says, nothing short of like surgery changes the connections in your brain faster than shame. And it's very important at this point that we make the shift from talking about just community, because community can do the gang members you were talking about earlier. They're modeling gang member behavior, so that is what you learn. So this is just a community thing. You learn from the people you're around. This is obvious to us. But I'm going to make the shift to Christian community, because the unique part of Christian community when it comes to shame is Christian shame does not leave you alone. So if we're all in a community, we're all in a relationship together, and Andrew, my good friend Andrew, comes into the room and he's like, y'all, I just robbed a bank. And we all look at him like, why on earth would you do that? And we communicate with our body language, maybe even with our actual language, that was a shameful thing to do, that he should be ashamed of himself for robbing the bank. His brain is going to fire and change to say, oh, bank robbery is not an acceptable thing for us to do. Okay, I've learned this. What happens next is critical. Because in Christian community, I then go to Andrew and I say, yeah, that was a boneheaded thing to do. You shouldn't rob banks. Christians don't rob banks. We shouldn't do that. But we still love you. And there is forgiveness in the gospel for you. And you are still part of this community. It doesn't diminish the fact that bank robbery or whatever else is a shameful thing, but it never leaves that person alone, because the danger when you leave that person alone is, yeah, the brain chemistry is changing, but it can just as easily flip to, no, bank robbery is cool, that community is the problem. So that's shame is incredibly powerful, especially for discipling and forming those instinctive reactions. But Christian shame, it has to be followed with, you are part of this community, we still love you, God still loves you, the forgiveness is there. Okay? And so these are the foundation, these are the practical, the biblical, and the theoretical foundations for what has kind of turned into this ministry, these practical steps that I hope are going to help you. I suppose I should stop at this point. Any questions on any of that? We clear? Yes?
The whole gang thing, one of the things that draws them into the gang mentality is a feeling of protection. Somebody's got their back. And so by converting and saying, well, we're a Christian gang, and we have your back, and God has your back. That type of thing is kind of how
you make the flip. Yeah. And you can do that with any number of, because especially with younger people, the sense of belonging is what a lot of them are chasing, the sense of protection, whether it's literal protection or social protection. Guys, we're perfectly suited to step into that and say, like, yes, this is a social space where you will always be loved. And hopefully it's a physically safe space as well. But okay, so those are the foundations that we're laying down. And that's why That's why we're going to do things the way I'm going to suggest that we do things. So kind of a brief implementation, and I think you have the steps I outlined on here. And you'll notice that it's really short. The first step is you identify leaders. Identify people who are in your congregation, who are capable of leading, and what you're really looking for in leaders, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, you're looking for someone who is grounded theologically on some level. They don't have to be an expert, but they at least have to have kind of that sense to when the conversation starts going in a place where it shouldn't or it gets really weird, that they can at least say, we got to flag this down. At very least, we got to ask some questions of someone who knows more. So you need leaders who can do that. You need them fundamentally who can say, we are meeting at this place in this time. So who have the organizational capability to do that. And then the third thing you need, and this might sound weird, but we're going to get to why it's important. You need leaders who can manage people. And preferably, you know those people who they can sense conflict before it actually breaks out? And a lot of times they'll speak some words to try and diffuse it. Ideally, you get those people so that if, for whatever reason, there's a conflict in these groups, they can kind of step in and undercut it before it becomes a problem. And I'm not saying don't deal with it, right? Bruce Hartung would smack me if I said don't deal with it. You deal with the conflict, right? But in a way that is going to be conducive to the community that you're building. So you identify these leaders. And then the rest of the steps are very simple. You go to the leaders, you say, hey, I want you to meet with your friends once a week and talk about Jesus stuff. Step 3, you give them the Jesus stuff to talk about. So you provide them the materials that you want them to be going through. And then the fourth is you check in and support them. That's you find your leaders, you tell them to meet, you give them stuff to meet around, and then you check in to make sure they feel supported and they have what they need. It really is as simple as that. And you say, no, it can't be. I promise. The amount of work I put into our small groups is really not that much. And I think they're the ministry that at least I'm most proud of at the congregation. So to explain kind of why these steps are what they are and how to go about them, that's where we come to these principles. So I have 7 principles. We're going to go through. Oh, that's a good biblical number. It was accidental, so at least we got that.
Not for you.
So the first step of this relational group ministry is from the beginning and at every point during, treat the groups as continuous. And what I mean by that is how many of you heard something along this line? Hey, we're starting groups for Lent. Would you like to join one? And I have no problem with doing a Lent group. I really don't. But what you have communicated to the person that you are recruiting to this group is going to be for Lent, and after Lent you are done. And we can say, well, you could hope that it moves on from that, or you can say, well, now that Lent's over, you can continue, and you can do that. But my argument is there is some procedural satisfaction in the brain to saying, I have committed to Lent. I'm going to do it through Lent. And it's as simple as saying less words. When you go to someone and you say, I'd like you to start a group or I'd like you to join a group, you just say, hey, there's this group meeting. You want to join it? Instead of saying, hey, there's this group meeting for Lent. You just don't put the timeline. And that includes both a timeline like Lent or Advent, but also a timeline like we are doing the Red Letter Challenge. Do you want to be in a group for the Red Letter Challenge? Because when they're done with the Red Letter Challenge, they're going to say, I have fulfilled my obligation. I have completed this contract. I am moving on with my life. And it really is as simple as using less words. You say, let's join a group. And the tricky thing here is it does force us to put more focus on the community than the content. Because a lot of times we use that content as a selling point. And I'm saying, well, let's shift the focus to the community. And then you can use the Red Letter Challenge. You can do a Lent study as a church, and those are great things. But you just you feed them into the groups that were pre-existing, that are already there doing whatever. So it's kind of a tricky shift, and I suspect that our denomination might be more uncomfortable with it than some others. But we're shifting from the focus on the content to the community, which is going to get to the content, but the community comes first. So that's the first principle, is you always talk about them and treat them as continuous entities. The next principle is that size does in fact matter. no matter what anyone has told you. And the ideal size, as I have down there, is between 8 and 12. And you say, well, Josh, the Bible says where 2 or 3 are gathered in his name, there he is in the midst of them. Yes, that is true. But if your group is 2 people and one of them says, I can't make it this week, the group isn't meeting. That's the thing with smaller groups. The critical number of people who can miss before you just have to cancel is low. So if you have 3 people and one person is missing, I'm guessing the other 2 aren't going to meet because it might be a little awkward. That's kind of weird, especially you're leaving the one person out. Like, that's a weird dynamic. Especially if, for whatever reason, if you were to have 2 guys and a girl in a group and then one of the guys can't make it, that group's probably not going to meet. That would be weird. That could be weird. And with 4. If one person's you might meet with just the 3 if you're a group of 4 and one person is missing. I don't know that you would. And if 2 people can't do it one week, you're definitely not going to meet because half the group is gone. And that's why I put 8. And it is a flexible number, right? None of this is set in stone because the reality is if you have 3 old guys who meet every Monday morning, and they've been meeting every Monday morning for coffee at McDonald's for 25 years, and they say, hey, we want to start a small group at McDonald's for coffee in the morning, and it's just the 3 of them, they're probably going to keep meeting. That's going to be fine. They can be a group of 3. As a general rule, though, especially if you're starting new groups, 3 is too small. 4 is too small, I would say. You're shooting for around 8 to get your critical mass. And on the flip side, you say, well, don't we want them to get bigger and larger and we want to grow and grow and grow? Kind of. To a point. Because once you start getting over 12, it's really easy to fall through the cracks. If you're in a room with 12 people, it's really easy to sit in the back corner and not say a word and not engage with the conversation and not be involved in building these relationships. When you're in a group of more than 12 people, it's really easy to feel like, oh, if I miss, it's not a big deal. So really what you're doing with the group size is you are creating this critical balance between it's not such that you cannot miss because the group cannot go on without you, but you are felt if you are not there. Your absence is felt. So that's kind of this balance. And again, 8 to 12, those are soft numbers. You can do some flexibility with that. Honestly, the 12 is probably a harder number than the 8 because 13 people, So that's principle number 2. Principle 1, treat them as continuous. Principle 2, size matters. Principle number 3 is build up leaders who can organize the group, lead discussions, and mediate as necessary. Because this is important, and leaders there is plural, not just because you want to have multiple groups, but also this does not have to be the same person. If you have one person in the group who's got the theological stuff figured out, and you have another person who organizes place and time, and you have another person who's good at balancing the relationships in the group, great. You have a group with 3 leaders. There's no problem with that. But you need the people with those skill sets, and especially if you're looking to start groups, especially if there isn't really a small group ministry at your congregation or in your context, and you're starting from scratch, you don't need to build them. They're there. Just find them. Find the leaders who can step into these roles and ask them. And here's the key. Ask them in person. And I say that because it's a lot harder to say no in person than it is over a text or over an email. I am an advocate for the use of peer pressure in ministry, and this is an instance of that. It's great. I've peer pressured people into doing a lot of stuff that they should do, and only a couple of things they shouldn't have done. But once you've kind of gotten, and we're starting to reach this point at Edgewater where I'm needing leaders for new groups, but we don't necessarily have anyone who has really already shown that capacity. So you build them up. And with the theological part might be the hardest, because that's pretty big, and it takes a while to build someone up to that point. But the organization one, you just meet someone for coffee and you kind of talk through how to just text everybody. You figure out a time that works. There are even some tools where you can send them something and they can fill it out and you can find a common time. So that one's pretty easy. And the mediation, honestly, I think the best way to lift people up like this, if you can't find them naturally occurring, look at ambassadors of reconciliation, search them up, and see if they can do a training, or if you can get some people to sign up for their training. Because they have, you would probably want to do, they have a class on personal reconciliation. If you can swing it, get your church to sponsor them, because they are not cheap classes. But have them go through that, because that'll give them the skill set, and that's definitely more than I can do in the time that I have. But so you build up those leaders, because you as organizer, or even you as group member, you are not going to be at all the groups. Okay? At Edgewater, we have 5 small groups running. If I was at every meeting for every small group, I would never spend any time at home with my wife. That would be a problem. That would not be healthy for me. That would not be healthy for my family, which in turn would probably not be the greatest thing for the church, because my quality of work would decrease, whatever. Nor should you be in all these meetings, because the reality is, the second, especially if you're a professional church worker, because I've noticed this, and it's kind of dramatic. The second you step into a conversation, you become the expert. Whether or not you are. If I walk into a Bible study and it's a discussion and there's a difficult question on the floor, and watch this next time you're in a conversation with a pastor or your professional church worker, the heads will turn. Like physically, the heads will turn to face the pastor. Because people are going to look for that answer. So, in fact, you shouldn't be for your own health, but if you're organizing this kind of ministry, I would say you shouldn't be involved with every group for the group's sake, because they can have a discussion that is more authentic, more relational without you there, which maybe hurts a little, which maybe sounds a little weird, but it is what it is. So you need these leaders because you're not there. You need the theological grounding because you're not there to steer the conversation away from places that shouldn't go. So you need the people to put that together. So that's principle number 3. Your leaders are really important. Principle number 4 is you're fostering trust with those leaders by supporting them. And you do this in 2 ways. The first is, very simply, make sure they have the materials they need. Make sure they have the Bible studies or the devotions or whatever their group is going through for material. Make sure you get it to them, and make sure you get it to them before they need it. So that's the one thing. And the other thing, and this is a much harder thing, and this hopefully is something you never have to do, but it comes up. If the leader has to make a difficult decision about the group, you have to support them in that. And here's my illustration, okay? If say a group leader comes to you and they say, pastor, or whatever your title is, but they probably call me Josh because I don't introduce myself as pastor. They'd say, Josh, there's this member of my group, and they're going through a really tough time, and we're there to support them, we really are, but every single group for the past month, for the past 2 months, they have made the entire time all about them. And no matter what the conversation is, it turns to them. And we need them to get support, but we can't be the ones we don't have the skill set to offer it. We need to ask them to not come to group for a little while. And you talk to them about that to make sure that is indeed the right decision, the right way to approach it. But if it is, and that group member has to go, or that group leader has to go to that group member and say, we can't, you got to take a break. Which is a very hard conversation for them to have. It does have to come from them, because they are the leader of the group, and if you're the one who's coming in, it undercuts their leadership. So they have to have this conversation, but then what you have to do for trust in that leader is when that group member comes to you and says, they kicked me out, you have to say, it's a hard decision, but we talked about it, and I support them in that. And we're going to find, and that's where you step in as in your role kind of as organizer or as leader or as spiritual caretaker. You say, we're going to find a place for you. We're going to find the support you need, but I do support this leader in saying that is not the place for it. So that's the big thing with leaders is if they come across those difficult situations, you have to have their back. Because if you don't, they might quit. And you're not going to find more leaders who are willing to step up for you. So that's principle number 4. 5 is foster trust with groups. And this, I heard that this was a strategy that got like major traction at some point, and I still can't believe it. Apparently, at some point, the logic was you keep growing small groups and you get them bigger and bigger and bigger, and then you split them in half and then have the two halves growing. And I hear that and I'm like, you put all that effort into building those relationships and building that community, and now you're just saying, nope. Because you want bigger numbers and you don't want to have to start a new group. So don't do that, because it destroys the trust. You built all these relationships and then you say, no, you know what? For organizational convenience, we're going to have you separate. Because again, the priority here is building the relationships, building the community. It doesn't make it harder because you're having to start new groups or find new leaders? Yeah, it does. But don't disrupt the relationships that are already there. And the other thing that sometimes gets seen is if you have an emerging leader who's in a group and you want to pull them out to start another group, don't. Because again, you're disrupting those relationships. I'm not saying don't use them. Maybe have them in a group and leading a group. Yes, sir?
Well, what about one set group is getting too big?
Stop publicizing it. And when someone said, and I've had this come up because I have a group that's getting big, and I've had people specifically request to be in the group because it's awesome. And that's where, as an organizer, you kind of have to say, that group is kind of, and you be really direct, because these reasons are pretty reasonable. So you just share those. You say, listen, if it gets much bigger, they're going to lose some of this ability to have conversations, so I'm really going to encourage you in another way. And the other thing is, people kind of naturally are going to move in and out at least a little bit because schedules change, lives change. But yeah, we're going to jump back to right here, because that actually reminds me of something I totally forgot. There are two pitfalls for small group ministry that I've seen in almost every church I've been at. One of them is a very small pitfall. One of them is a lot bigger, and touches on what you brought up. The first is branding. Don't call them small groups, because I'll admit, there are some places where small groups have been fine and everybody's like, oh yeah, small groups are a good thing. But most people, if you go to someone who's not in a small group and you say, hey, you want to join a small group, they're going to roll their eyes. They might do it internally, but they're going to be rolling their eyes. They're like, no, I don't want to join a small group. Or you can't. Don't call it. And you say, well, what do we call them? If you really have to put a name on it, for a time, we call them community groups. There are some places that will call them life groups, which kind of screams 1990s church whatever to me. But you can do it. There's nothing wrong with that. But personally, I'm an advocate for not giving them a name. Just let them be. They're groups. We want you to be in a group. Kind of loosen that control. And that's one of the reasons the title for this session is Grassroots Community. Look at it more organically. So it doesn't necessarily need a name. It doesn't necessarily need a sign-up sheet. It doesn't need an announcement in the bulletin. So that's the first. Brand it. Be careful when you're branding it, because small groups as a word pairing has a lot of connotations for a lot of people, and a lot of them are not positive. Yes, sir?
Yeah, one name just came up. There was a group called Ragamuffins, and again, we had a waiting list.
Oh, yeah.
It was one of those kind of deals. So while people were waiting on the waiting list to get into this cool group, other groups so badly formed.
Exactly.
And then, so everybody was not placated, but it was...
They found their home. They found their home. And speaking of the young adult group that I do lead, the name is At Least We're Not Going to Hell. Because one of our very first conversations was like, what's the worst thing that can happen to you? And I was really proud of all these young adults, because none of them said, well, you could die. They all said, well, you go to hell. And we concluded with, well, at least we're not going to hell. Something else could be going on, but at least we got that going for it. It's in my phone as the AL, whatever the initials are. That's the group in my phone. It's pinned. I could pull it up right now. And then the other mistake that a lot of churches make is they just shove people into groups. They say, we're starting groups, sign up and we'll put you in a group. And I've seen it done a couple different ways. You do it just in the order they sign up, and you kind of say, oh, the first 5 people, they're in a group, and the second 5, or they'll do it geographically. Oh, these people live close together, so they'll be in a group. Which sounds fine, but the difficulty with that is there are a lot of relationships already in your congregation, and you're not really taking advantage of those. Because for a lot of those groups, they all show up to the first meeting, and it's crickets because it's a room of strangers. And optimistically would say, well, they'll build their relationship, yeah, or they could make it through whatever the first study you give them is, and then say, this is not worth all the effort, all of the social, emotional energy I'm spending, I'm done. So instead, and that's why this implementation is you find the leaders and tell them to find their friends. The relationships are already there, and what's really cool is that leader has a relationship with everyone in the room, but though the people in the room are not necessarily connected, but there's at least kind of that buffer, and then they become connected. So those are the two mistakes that I've seen a lot. Branding, which is not a huge deal, and then not starting from scratch when you really don't need to, which for me is a much bigger deal. So thank you for kind of reminding me of that. Stepping forward, keep groups whole, and that's that second part. The focus is on the community and the relationships. So don't disrupt them unless you absolutely have to. And it would have to be a pretty cataclysmic event for that to come to pass. So, yes?
Could I ask for a little?
Of course.
What if there's a group that maybe sees multiplication as their own intrinsic motivation for what they're doing? They want to be invitational. So it's not as if the church is demanding a split due to size, but they see it as
their role.
leaders within us. And now we're to a point where we can't have that discussion because there's too many of us. So we're going to give each other hugs, a smile. We're going to meet separately. Still see each other on Sundays. But so, not every group does it well.
Yes.
But if a group sees that as the mission higher than the wholeness of the group, have you had experience with any of that happening?
I haven't. So this is a knee-jerk reaction. I think I'd be on board with that. If it's an internal decision of the group and not something that you're forcing, and they're like, we're okay with this, I'd say, yeah, that can be appropriate. If they're not necessarily so healthy about it, I would maybe work to change their mindset a little bit, which is a long game answer. But then the other thing I would put, and we're going to circle back to this, but still get the bigger group together sometimes. You say, yeah, now you have your separate groups, but maybe when you have a week where you're just doing a fellowship event, have everybody at the fellowship event so you still are building those connections. Which fits perfectly into the next principle, which is do everything possible to encourage the growth of relationships within groups. I swear I didn't plant these guys. By setting expectations for fellowship and service alongside Bible study. Okay, and you can ask anyone in my congregation, my expectation that I lay down with leaders is that once a month, when they meet, it's not to do a Bible study. It is just to hang out. And that looks different. We have a group that meets on Wednesday mornings. They're mostly retired people because it's Wednesday morning and most other people have work. There are a couple young moms who join. They went to the apple orchard one week. Instead of doing their Bible study, they went up to, there's an apple orchard near us. I think they actually did pick apples, and they went to lunch or something. There was another time they did a surprise breakfast for one of the leaders' birthdays, and they met at a pancake house and they did a breakfast. And that's what that looks like for them. My young adult group, if I said, hey, let's go to the apple orchard, I don't think they would be sold on that. They might, but I really don't think so. But next Friday, I'm taking them all to a hockey game. I've had them all over, and we've played Mario Kart. Like, those are kind of the social things that we tried to go bowling once, showed up at the bowling alley, the wait was 3 hours to get a lane, so we had ice cream instead. But it looks different, but as a leader, you step in and you say, you need to take the time just to be together and to see each other. If we look back to the benefits of community and the modeling, that modeling has to take place in different situations. If you just see them in Bible study, you're going to learn really good what it looks like to be a Christian in Bible study, but you won't know what it looks like to be a Christian in an apple orchard or at a bowling alley or when you can't get into the bowling alley because the wait's ridiculous. So you need these different contexts to get the full impact of that community. And then the other part, and this is something admittedly at Edgewater we're working on, is also set an expectation for service. where the group takes some time every once in a while and they meet for service to serve together. Our Wednesday morning group, which it's the awesome group that everyone wants to get into. The Wednesday morning group a couple weeks ago, they catered a lunch we meet at a public school on Sundays, so they brought in lunch for all the teachers during the week to thank them for letting us use their school, to thank them for what they do for the kids. So they did that, which is just one more place where the principal being my head elder really comes in handy. So you got to make sure that it's not just the Bible study they're doing together, that they're also seeing each other in different contexts and just being together in community. And then the final principle we have here is meet people where they're at with content and format. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that. When I say meet people where they're at with content, some people are not ready to dive into the apology to the Augsburg Confession. In fact, I would argue that most people aren't there. In fact, I would say, I don't really want to do that. I did my studying of the Book of Concord. I don't particularly want to dredge through it again. I read it kind of devotionally, but that's about it these days. Some people will be there. And my vicar right now is putting together a group of guys who I could see them doing a study like that. But I also have guys who, if you introduced that, they'd be like, nope, I'm out. Gonna go to the bar. Which is fine. Meet people where they're at. If people they need to walk through the Gospels a little bit, have them walk through the Gospels a little bit. You meet people where they're at with and that's with the content. And the other is with format. Because I think and maybe this isn't typical, but this is what I always seen growing up. You sit down in a circle-ish kind of thing. You read some Bible verses, and then you talk about them. There's some questions, there's some discussion. And you kind of go back and forth. And that is great. My young adults love that, love the discussion-based stuff. A lot of my adult groups also do that same kind of thing. I have some guys in the congregation, that is not their thing. They are not academics. They are not people who like to discuss things. That's not them. So the format has to, and this is a group that I'm working to get off the ground, and I'm really excited about it because I think it's a very promising concept. The thing that these guys do have in common is after church, you'll see them in the back, they're talking about sports. Whatever season it is, whether it's football or baseball, unfortunately none of them are hockey fans. NASCAR, I believe, also makes it into the conversation, and they're talking about sports. And one of my elders is in that group, so I go to my elder and I say, hey, can you invite all those guys over to your house for Thursday night football or Monday night football? And I'm going to give you a devotion to read at halftime. And that's your small group. Is it a lot less content than you would cover sitting down and go, yes. Does it look a lot different than maybe what we think it quote-unquote should be? Yeah, probably. Are they building a community centered around Jesus Christ and growing in Him? Yeah, they are. Now, do I eventually want them to dive a little bit deeper into that stuff? Yes, that's ultimately a goal. But I'm a lot happier with them meeting, watching football, and doing a devotion than I am with them sitting at home watching football by themselves. Okay? So that's, you got to meet people where they're at, not where you want them to be. So those are kind of the principles, and I do genuinely believe that unless you're in a very, very weird situation, those principles are going to hold no matter where you're trying to do group ministry. And that's kind of where they lead into this implementation. You find your leaders, they build a group of relationships they have, and then you supply them to keep going. Which there are some weaknesses in this approach, because there are a lot of ways to build community at a church. There are a lot of ways to do it. This is one of them. I think it's a particularly strong one. That's why I'm doing a session on it, and I've spent the time on this. But it's only one of them, and it does have some weaknesses. And the first is cliques.
Yeah.
If you're doing a continuous group, and especially once they have been meeting for years, and they always meet with the same people, and these are their people, there is a danger that it becomes us And then there's everybody else. And we don't trust everybody else because they're not us. I'll admit that's a danger, but it's one you can get out ahead of. And I'm going to say two things to that. The first thing you can do to get out ahead of it is have people involved in other teams or groups within the congregation. The example from our church is, as I mentioned, we're a plant. So we set our stuff up every Sunday. And each one of my elders has a Sunday that they're in charge of. And on the Sunday that they are in charge, that means they are finding the slide person, they are finding the sound person, they are finding a setup crew, they are finding a cleanup crew. They have a team. So the encouragement is, for each of these elder teams, make sure they're not all from the same small group. And then you're in your small group, but you're also in this other group. You're in this team that sets up worship. So whatever your teams look like, whatever your group, like whatever things you have at church, just make sure it's not all the same small group doing them. And that's something you can kind of be, you can be the bad guy a little bit and say, no, it can't be from the same small group. Only some of you can do this. And that's an acceptable thing to tell people no to. You have my permission. You can blame me because what are they going to do? Fly out to California to... Anyway, not important. So that the one, and the other weakness with cliques is just make sure you're also doing things for the community of the congregation as a whole. Having a fellowship event once a year is not sufficient. Because just think about this. If you meet someone for the first time here at Best Practices, and you see them once a year, you might be friendly, but you're not necessarily friends, right? Like if you're in a terrible situation, the first person you call isn't the rando that you met at Best Practices and you see once a year. And this is kind of a uniquely community-driven thing where you're going to make better friendships than you would at a lot of other once-a-year things. But in your congregation, if I see Tim from the other service exactly once a year at the church fellowship event, that is not enough for us to build a relationship. What we do is once a month, because we have found that if you do more than that, people don't have time. People don't have time. But if you do once a month, if you do a cookout, if you do a bingo night, whatever it looks like for your context, just get people together, and you'll kind of undercut a lot of that temptation toward clique, that trend toward cliques. What are the other weaknesses I had pointed out? I did have notes. See, I did prepare for this in advance. And then the other weakness that I think is probably most prevalent is there's a feeling of a loss of control. Especially if you're in a position of leadership and you're used to kind of having a finger on everything. You don't. The leaders have it. You don't really, I don't really know what's going on in these groups. I trust my leaders when they tell me kind of how things are going and what's going on, but I don't necessarily know specifically. And there are two responses to that. The first is you stay engaged, right? So with these groups, occasionally I'll reach out to leaders and say, hey, I'd like to come for a session. And what I do is I say, I'd like to do an ask the pastor kind of thing, where they can just, any questions that are difficult or they're struggling with, they have that chance to ask me in kind of a smaller setting. And the other thing is, with the loss of control, the other part of my solution is to, sorry John, get over it. Because you're not in control anyway. So you don't even really need to pretend that you are. God will take care of things. But it is kind of scary to feel like there's this thing going on and I can't really, like with that group that you were describing where their mission is multiplication, you only have so much control over that. And by only so much, I mean very little. So those are some of the weaknesses. And then what I want to close with are just 3 examples from my congregation that kind of illustrate a lot of these. And I'm going to start with the Wednesday morning group because I've talked about them a lot already. Dave and Carolyn, probably should have asked them permission to tell this story, but they'd be fine with it. Dave is an elder in our church, and before he's retired, but he had been a Lutheran principal for a long time, and his wife was a Lutheran educator. They got that theological part pretty good. They're going to make sure everybody stays kind of in the lane they need to be in. They're organizationally minded, and they're both very good relationally. So I went to Dave and Carolyn and I said, hey. And the other thing, you have to look at who are they connected to. Because if you have a leader, but the only people they're connected to are already in groups, it's it's going to be hard for that leader to gather. But Dave and Carolyn, they were connected to a bunch of people who weren't in a group. So I said, you want to get all your friends together and hang out? And they do. They meet every Wednesday morning, 10 a.m. they go through a Bible study. Probably takes them about 2 hours, even though the Bible study is maybe a half hour of content. Because they just hang out, which is another thing. If that's what it looks like, go for it. You're building. I went to a Bible study a couple weeks ago. I did one of the Ask a Pastor things, and it was like 20 minutes into the night, and we hadn't started anything. And one of them got really they're like, "Sorry, this kind of happens every time." And I'm like, "No, this is what I want to be happening." Like, if it takes you 30 minutes to start the content, great. That means you're building relationships for 30 minutes. But that's Wednesdays. And they've done the service project. They've done all sorts. And this group is incredible. They pray together. When something tough comes up in their lives, the first people they share it with is that group. And that's kind of, if I'm going to hold up, like, here's the gold standard of what I think this is supposed to look like, it's pretty close to the Wednesday morning group. So that's one example. The next example I'm going to use is my young adult group, which looks different because it's filled with young adults. We have a couple of high schoolers, we have a college kid, and we have a couple just like young professional kind of things. And the reality of all those different life situations is you are the bottom of the totem pole. My one guy, he works at a car dealership. He does not get to dictate his schedule. If his boss says, you're going to be selling cars on Sunday morning, he's selling cars on Sunday morning. So what this group has been identified with more than anything else is flexibility. When people get new schedules, they say, hey, I can't make Tuesday nights anymore. So we change. We've met on Wednesday nights. We've met on Tuesday nights. I think very briefly we met on Thursday nights. We met on Sunday nights. But we change based on the people in the group. And the content has changed as well. We've done some Bible studies. We've done some devotional stuff. We've done some stuff where we look at pop culture, and then we kind of turn it back around and we say, well, how do we react to this? So like, we've been all over the place. We've been all over the map. And that's kind of the identifier of the stage of life that we are in. It's a time of a lot of flux and flexibility, which I'll tell you, as an organization person, it drives me nuts. It is a struggle for me sometimes, because I'm like, I want a list and I want an attendance sheet and I want this to be more stable, but that's just not the position of life we're in. So that's our young adult small group. And then the last group that I told you a little bit about is this football group. And there's not much to it. It is meet for football at halftime, you do your devotion. But I think it's a really promising idea to get guys involved who would not get involved with group ministry otherwise. So I'm really excited about that. I think that is all. And then the last thing I'll point out is on your little sheet, there's a reference list. These are books that their stuff kind of has influenced my thinking in a powerful way. I'm not going to read it to you, because if you can't read the reference list, then you really don't need the reference list. The one thing I will point out is the one by Hauerwas is written pretty. He's a pretty dense writer. He was the theologian of the year at Yale at Duke Divinity School a few years back. So he operates up here, and the books by Thompson are pretty dense. So that's kind of and then the last thing I have on here is the resources. That is my personal email. If you have questions, if you want to collaborate on something, if you just need someone to touch base with, use it. I check it at least 4 days a week. I really do my best when I'm not working to not check my email. So, but jamleborious@gmail.com. It is there for you, for whatever you need. And then those two other URLs. If you're like really excited, I want to do this, I want to form a group, what do I put in front of them? That first one, the Grassroots Bible discussions. Every time I'm finished, because I write all the studies for our groups. I just write them myself. Every time I'm done with one, I'm just going to throw it in that folder. So if you want it, take it, use it. Right now, I think there's one on James. There's one on Peter. It's first. It goes through all Peter. And soon I will be adding one on Matthew, and one that I'm working with a buddy from seminary on just surveying Scripture and just going from big story to big story. I'm not putting unfinished ones in there. I'm just putting the finished ones in there. But you can use those. And if you're interested in my academic work, if when I was talking about what I'm studying for my dissertation, you're like, ooh, I'd like to know more about that, I did make a folder. I threw the papers that are relevant to it in there, and when I'm done with when I'm like going through my research and stuff, I'll throw that in there too. I don't actually anticipate that link to get used, but I figured I would throw it out there if anyone was interested. So that is the resource page on the back. And I do have a card if you want it. All it has is my phone number on it. Because I don't normally hand these out for business reasons. I hand them out to people who might need someone to pray with them. So there we go. Oh, thanks. It came for free with the business cards. I keep it in my car for when we go to restaurants. And I was like, oh, I should bring that to my session. That'd be a good idea. So that's all I have for you. Any questions? Any comments? Anyone think I'm a heretic? Only on Tuesdays. Yes, ma'am.
Do you use book studies? Because what I found is that really very, very... So a couple of the books we've done is Living in Babylon and the 10 Dumbest Things that Smart Christians Believe in. We're just finishing that. The interaction between generations is amazing.
Yeah, so my stance on book studies is not necessarily a popular one. I'm hesitant with them, not because I don't like the books. And if someone wants to do a book club, we're trying to start a book club at Edgewater because we have a lot of people who really like books and those kind of books. It's just a lot of the people who want to do a book club don't want to lead a book club. So so here's my thing with the books. First of all, you can't call it a Bible study anymore. Because that's a pet peeve of mine when people say it's a Bible study and you're reading a book, which is that's just a name thing. Here's my thing. You have to get the resources because you need the books, and a lot of times the desire is that you read them in between, which for a lot of groups is fine, but for a lot of groups they're like, I don't want homework for my group, so that's a. So when it comes to book studies, I'm not opposed to them. I have some, I'm not seriously opposed to them. I have some groups who do them, and to varying degrees of success. I don't necessarily push them in front of people. I'd rather, I'm going to put you in front of the Word. I'm going to have you discuss that directly.
Well, that's the discussion is about, because if the reference is all...
Right, and they're really faithful books. I have no problem with the books themselves, but if someone's going to ask me what content do you want me to jump into as a group, I'm always going to say, just get into the Word. Just jump into the Word.
Well, both of these people are already doing a Bible study,
Oh, yeah.
and so they want to know, how does that relate to living life?
Yeah.
How does it relate to where we're in? And that's the thing. And what's interesting is that the older men are the ones that are they're like, this is the best thing.
They're in it. Yeah. So it can be good. It's not necessarily what I push, but it can be good. Anything else?
You want to plug your podcast?
Oh, actually, yes, I did mean to do that. I do have a podcast. It has nothing to do with this. It is called Man Buns and Jesus. I have a buddy I graduated seminary with who also he never puts his man bun on, like he never puts it up when we're recording. But we do both, at least theoretically, have man buns. And we just, like you were talking about, we want to know how this applies to our lives. Our first 2 seasons, we have like 70 episodes out now. Our first 2 seasons, we just picked different topics and beat them to death with like, how do Christians approach this? We had Joel Bierman on from the seminary, and we talked about 2 realms. And I told someone that, and they're like, you got him to do a podcast? And I'm like, it wasn't even hard. I emailed him once, and he was like, yeah, sure. Just tell me when I need to log on. I have a lot of fun with it. It's a little irreverent, but I'm a little irreverent. So we're on all the major podcasting, so Spotify, Apple Podcasts. This season we changed directions a little bit. We've been just walking through Corinthians and kind of pulling topics from that. If you want a vibe for it, it's like if you read Corinthians and then you sat down with your friend to talk about Corinthians. That's what we're doing. Except this week, 4 days ago, our episode for this week released, and then on Tuesday we did a break and we talked about the controversy with the large catechism, and we dove into those issues a little bit, so that was fun, and I hope I don't get canceled for that. But so yeah, if you're interested in Man Buns and Jesus, I'd subscribe. That'll make my ego a little bit better. Thanks, John. Other John. He spells his name differently than you do. Man buns and Jesus. Yes. It's here to stay until I start going bald, and then it's all just gonna go. So, anything else? Anyone want to make fun of the man bun now that it's out? Andrew.
I was just telling your wife that I remember what your hair was like when you got married. It's not shorter.
It was. And before that, it was even shorter. But when she saw me with a butt, that's my wife, by the way, everyone. When her name is Chris. She's delightful. She's carrying our son, Ezekiel. It's pretty great. And she saw me with a buzz cut, and she's like, "Yeah, no, that's not. It's not the move."
I gave him a buzz cut once.
She's also like, the beard is stuck because she's like, "Yeah, the beard has to stay."
14.
Yeah, the beard is a necessity, ladies and gentlemen, which is great.
Can you share the picture of your elders groups of your man bun?
I don't think I ever got that picture, and I'm disappointed.
Advisors that had a man bun.
That's
We
awesome.
went to an elders meeting. We were going to try to talk to go to church with that, but
I was disappointed you guys never showed up
well,
to church with your man buns
I
on.
had it in the car.
It's okay. It's okay. Forgiveness abounds. Yes, sir.
A lot of this is kind of reminding me of just the book of Acts and just like the early Christians just being in homes. Is that the inspiration behind a lot of this?
It's definitely part of it. A lot of it, I got to be honest, a lot of it I've kind of stumbled into.
Yeah.
And like after noticing how effective it's been, I'm like, oh, I should have seen this in Acts and in Paul. But a lot of it, it's like, oh, that worked.
Yeah.
Cool. And then I'll go back and say, oh, I should have known that was going to work. So, yes, sir.
I don't have a developed question yet,
Esteemed
so I'll probably
Reverend John Carolus.
I'll text you, email you later. But I'm trying to figure out, what's the balance between encouraging groups to multiply or to grow or to take on kind of an evangelistic mindset while also preserving the relationships that have been there. It doesn't seem like that never encouraging a group to become more than one group is totally the answer, but also I feel like I learned a lot about why it's important to preserve groups as whole as much as you can.
Yeah, so this is something the Thompson guy writes a little bit on how Paul looked at community in that way. Because we think, there's a lot of evangelism going on there in the early church. But Paul doesn't really approach it as like, you need to go out and pull people in. His attitude is more, the community of the gospel and the message we share is so powerful and magnetic that it's going to pull people. And when people come and they're pulled into the orbit, you need to be ready to bring them in more fully and to explain what's going on. But so when it comes to communities, I would say you don't need to push kind of the gathering or the evangelism as much as just make sure the community is good. And it's going to pull people. Like if you're in a group that's awesome, you're going to say to your outside friend, hey, this group is awesome. I'd love for you to join in this. And it's almost kind of an organic, like the Wednesday group that people are like, I want to be in the Wednesday group. They never really push like, hey, join our group. It's just like people hear about what's going on there and they're like, I want to be a part of that.
Yeah, I agree. Like an implicit, the strongest implicit, witness in the New Testament is the unity of the gospel,
Exactly.
which is found, in relationships and groups. Yeah. But,
So that's what I would say.
You have someone come in who's heard about or seen some of this, and then there's a few groups in existence. Is it a matter of connecting them to the right group or forming a group that's good for them with other newcomers? I guess that's say you've got a solid group or two going, and then you've got a population of newcomers that may or may not be enough to sustain a new group just on their own.
Right. Well, and then also, are you going to have the leadership you need coming from the new?
Yeah, exactly. Probably not. Right.
So I think it depends on who they are and who your newcomers are. I think our push, because this is part of our membership. If you want to be a member at Edgewater, you have to be involved in group ministry. Unless you're transferring from another church, then I trust that the other pastor discipled you, and I just say, as long as your other pastor is cool with it, you're going to... Anyway, that's beside the point. So you have to be part of this group. So really what I push is you probably came to church with a friend, that friend has a group. There you go. If it's, because I do have a situation, I had a family who kind of more or less just came off this, I mean, not literally off the street, but they just kind of showed up. And it's tough because I don't think the answer is to start a brand new group with just newcomers, but I might see it as an opportunity to pull some more members in from the congregation who haven't been involved yet, and then kind of do a hybrid, because that also helps with assimilation, because they're in that smaller setting to form relationships with the members who are there.
I like what you said too about, how do you equip someone who's being fed from a group, who has the gifts to maybe pour into a group, and so they can continue to exist as a member here, and begin to develop as a leader here, if they've got that availability.
Yeah. No problem. And the other cool thing is if you need it, I have a couple members who are in more than one group, and if you need to work that, like, you come up to me, I would like to be in more than one weekly Bible study. I'm not going to tell you no. That sounds pretty great to me. Yeah, you go for it.
And are they all weekly?
Pretty much all weekly. I think you could probably do it less frequently. You'd have to have a special group to do it more frequently. But the hesitation with that is the less frequently you meet, the less you have opportunity to grow in relationship.
My small group meets every 6 weeks.
Oh.
Yes.
But your personality is so magnetic that the relationships just choo, 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 choo.
Our young adult one, like, we check in weekly, but we definitely don't do it.
Yeah, that's fair. There are a lot of weeks for young adults it's like, no, we can't do this week. Never mind, guys. So we probably meet 2 to 3 times a month. Is probably where we settle.
Yeah. That's at least we're not in hell.
Yeah, at least we're not going to hell. It's been more consistent lately, ever since I challenged one of the members and said, listen, if you're not there on Sunday, you need to be there on Wednesday, and if you miss Wednesday, you better be there Sunday morning. And he was like, yeah, I can do that. So we've met pretty much every week since then, except for this week because I was here. And next week because it's Ash Wednesday. Oh, I got to prep for Ash Wednesday.
Thank you very much.
All right. Go in peace. Serve the Lord.
Thank you.